I began my initial research into the illustrative world of Shaun Tan when I was only 7 or 8 years old. I've been unable to stop my curious fingers from prizing a well-thumbed copy of The Arrival from my grandma's bookshelf and letting my eyes spill all over the wordless novel in delight. Pleased that I was occupied, my grandmother handed me a roll of tracing paper and a pencil, with which I eagerly used to start plagiarising my favourite parts of Tan's incredible illustrations. It was only when I held up my traced artwork in front of me that I was puzzled and frustrated. Why weren't my drawings making me feel the same fascinated delight that Tan's were? What was it about this series of black and white graphite drawings that awoke a kind of familiarity and joy in me? The Arrival by Shaun Tan, 2006, is a 128-page long picture book telling the story of an unnamed man leaving his family to seek a better life, somewhere over the ocean, in an unfamiliar and bizarre new country. In this universal story of immigration, Tan highlights the struggles of being a refugee in a place where people speak an indecipherable language, abide by different laws and customs, eat, wear and own such strange and confusing food, clothes and animals. By following the story of the protagonist in a series of sepia-toned monochromatic drawings inspired by old photo albums, Tan lays a sense of feeling desperately lost or alone in a baffling new reality, where it's hard to feel as if you belong. In order to allow the audience to step into the shoes of the unnamed man, Tan creates a fictional world designed to be unfamiliar and jarring to any reader of any background and experiences. Shaun starts by introducing us, the audience, into the book with a world that feels familiar to our own. Recognisable objects and scenes resembling our own everyday experience. A simple family unit, the ethnically ambiguous protagonist, an opportunity to relate our own lives to what we see on the page. It's later, when the man travels to the new country, that Tan uses his imagination to introduce fantastical, unrecognisable creatures, futuristic machinery, miraculously floating ships, bewildering architecture and more. Here's an example of one of the pages that does just this. In this series of panels, Tan creates this incredible sense of familiarity that juxtaposes with so much strangeness. In the third panel, we are greeted with a recognisable image of a man having his beard shaved on the street. It appears to be outside of a shop front. The figure is dressed in a white covering to keep the hair from falling on his clothes. It's an irrevocably human picture. It's only after we see this reminder of our own lives that we notice the strange, alien creatures in the foreground, a reminder that we are nowhere that we thought we knew. Similarly, in the next panel over, we see a couple of street musicians with a music stand, surrounded by pigeon-like birds, reminiscent of something you might see in London. However, there's nothing familiar about the instrument, with its strange shape and nonsensical compartments. What is it? What does it sound like? What time period does it put us in? By creating so many of these unanswered questions in this entirely wordless project, Tan echoes the experience of an immigrant in a confusing land without the language or knowledge to find their own answers. There is little to no guidance on how we should interpret Tan's drawings, encouraging us to work hard to search for our own meaning out of his make-believe worlds. The fantasy is disorientating, capturing the texture of the migrant experience in ways that straightforward realism could never. A well-put interpretation from the New York Times on Tan's use of imagination. This disorientating, almost dreamlike style of art has led some to classify Tan's work as surrealist. However, Tan himself states he's never felt completely comfortable with the label surrealism, as an interest in dreams has never really played a key part in his work. I'm more interested in some kind of equivalent to reality, in itself quite rational and meaningful, but just different to what we might be expecting. A genre that fits his art slightly better might be magical realism, a term coined in the 1920s by a German art critic. While Tan claims there is no single source of inspiration for the project, the topics of migration, journeying, and newness were derived somewhat from his own life experiences in travelling around the world, the immigration of his father from Malaysia to Australia in 1960, and further research into other migrant stories such as the mass European immigration to the US. In Tan's own words, he also describes after gathering anecdotes from his friends who were born overseas, he became aware of the many common problems faced by all migrants, regardless of nationality and destination. The problems he went on to list range from grappling with language difficulties and homesickness, to poverty and loss of social status. There has been debate over whether The Arrival is a timely piece of work, or whether it's still relevant today. I would argue that the book is still incredibly relevant today, helped by the ambiguity of the location and time. The figure of the migrant is poignant in today's political context, as nationalism continues to grow in the West. Xenophobia is an ongoing issue, as well as the fact that people are still fleeing from war-torn countries in search of a better life. However, are there other ways that this book proves relevant to the viewer without any experience of immigration? For this is the book that kept me entertained for hours as a child, and the furthest I'd gone was on holiday to France. This story about coming at a new and forbidding world from a completely different angle is something not only relevant to immigrants, but to children. Seeing the world in an entirely new way, relying on first-time experiences to learn and grow. That childhood innocence of trying to wrap your curious mind around something new. To any outside viewer, it's clear that The Arrival was not aimed at any particular age group, and contains some mature and complex themes that adults are more likely to recognise faster. However, there was a reason this project was published as a children's book and went down incredibly with people of a younger age, myself as a prime example. Children are living a similar experience to the Nameless Man, discovering, growing, surrounded by unfamiliar objects, language and customs, yet mesmerised and fascinated by it at the same time. It's true that The Arrival does focus on dark feelings of isolation, loneliness and hardship, especially through the various stories we hear of other refugees passed along the way, such as the soldier losing a leg and returning home to a destroyed town, or the young girl forced into harsh labour until she escapes onto a nearby train. However, one thing that I feel children may pick up easier than adults in The Arrival is the beautiful, playful and almost magical nature of life in this alternate world. Without much understanding of the deeper meaning of this book as a child, it was illustrations like this one, The New Country, a full-page drawing of a fantastical harbour, that completely amazed me. In this unfolding scene, Tan creates a picture plane in which the viewer is positioned in mid-air, looking down on the people who stare out at the city they are about to enter. All we can see of these massive bodies is the back of their heads, each person unidentifiable, one and the same, about to embark on the same journey to start a better life. Unlike some of the darker images in this novel of fleeing refugees, I feel that this one contrasts by evoking a sense of hope and prosperity for the newcomers. The people point and stare in fascination at the monumental statue in the harbour. The statue itself depicts two men from different boats, joined together in a handshake of unification. In each boat there are different objects, and the two figures are accompanied by different animals, almost as if they are modelling the experience of the unnamed protagonist, moving from his own world to an entirely new one. The handshake seems like a symbol of welcome to the boats coming in, a metaphorical promise of joining communities, two contrasting cultures becoming one. Other symbols that reflect a message of hope and optimism are the bright white reflection on the glittering water, the scattered birds flying up above evoking a sense of freedom, and the foggy outline of a prospering city and its skyscrapers, indicating wealth and job opportunities. Tan's use of colour also plays an important part in this illustration and the book as a whole. Tan described his use of a monochromatic colour palette as an idea that he borrowed from looking through old family photo albums. He was inspired by the fact that photo albums are just another kind of picture book, a series of chronological pictures, each part of a story that is someone's life. By copying this format, he could tell the story of the unnamed man in a similar way. I think that the minimal use of colour also allows the viewer to imagine and fill in the colours for themselves, an element of creative freedom which makes exploring the pages more personal. Or perhaps the lack of colour is simply because it's irrelevant to Tan's message, and he would rather the viewer focus on the story being told than the way it was coloured. It's worth noting, Tan does tactfully use subtle colour changes from scene to scene to evoke certain relevant emotions. For example, happier panels such as this have a warmer, yellower hue with connotations of joy or safety. More dismal scenes are cooler toned and darker, which creates a more tense or fearful atmosphere, even subconsciously for the viewer. Tan uses his illustrations in The Arrival and other works to explore topics such as belonging, isolation and journey in an incredibly unique way. The impact his work makes on its audience could not be achieved through a singular piece or painting, and his art is a great example of the way illustration and artistic storytelling can be just as powerful and thought-provoking as something on a gallery wall. I will end my presentation with a quote from Tan himself. "I don't see a huge difference between painting a landscape plein air and sitting at a desk drawing something from the speculative subconscious. They are both ways of making an image that ultimately resides in the mind and of what it means to be alive in a particular place and time." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Freya. I learned a lot there. So I've got another big question for you to get your teeth into. Do you think that graphic novels like this can ultimately effect meaningful change in the world?
Yeah, I absolutely do think they can affect meaningful change, just in the same way that any other piece of art can affect change in the people that look at it. graphic novels in the same way can do that, because in some ways they can actually explore certain topics in more detail than one piece, because you get to be part of a story and it entices the viewer in a way that a single piece doesn't, because it brings you in and it keeps you interested in the same figure or protagonist or a storyline rather than just one picture. So I do think, yeah, graphic novels can really explore some powerful concepts, and the way that they use multiple images in like the form of a story is personal to the audience in a way that they really feel like afterwards they can change and they can make changes in the world from it.
Thank you.